At their golden anniversary, I brought a gift no one expected, the truth that would shatter our family forever. The air in my grandparents' house was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and 30 years of unspoken resentment. It was their 50th wedding anniversary, a golden jubilee meant to be a testament to love and endurance. For me, it was just another command performance in a long-running play where I was cast as the villain. The whole clan was there, cousins I hadn't seen in years, great aunts who only remembered me as a toddler, and the core group, the ones who mattered, the ones who had passed judgment on me before I could even walk. As I made my way through the living room, conversations would dip into whispers, and eyes would follow me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was used to it. To most of them, I wasn't just Alex. I was the harbinger of doom, the walking, talking embodiment of when things went wrong. I was the family curse. The nickname was coined by my Aunt Carol, my father's older sister, and it stuck like tar. It all traced back to the year I was born. My grandfather had built a thriving construction empire from the ground up. It was the family's pride and joy, the source of our comfortable upper-middle-class life. But within 6 months of my birth, the company collapsed in a spectacular, debt-ridden implosion. It was sudden, catastrophic, and nobody ever seemed to have a clear explanation for it. Except, of course, for Carol. She found an explanation that suited her perfectly. The company had been rock solid for decades, and then I was born, and poof, it was all gone. It was a coincidence, a terrible, tragic coincidence. But in Carol's hands, it became a narrative of cause and effect. I was the bad omen, the crack in the foundation. My parents did their best to shield me, but Carol's poison was insidious. She'd whisper it at holidays, mention it in passive-aggressive asides during birthdays. "Oh, be careful with that vase. It's one of the last nice things we have left from before. You know," she'd say, her eyes flicking towards me. My cousins, her children, grew up believing it. They treated me like I was radioactive. I spent my entire childhood and adolescence as the family scapegoat, the reason we weren't rich anymore, the reason Grandpa had a heart attack in his late 50s, the reason the family wasn't what it used to be. Every misfortune, big or small, was laid at the feet of the curse. Tonight, the performance was at its peak. Aunt Carol, dressed in a gaudy gold dress that screamed, "Look at me," was holding court by the fireplace. She saw me approach and her smile tightened, a barely perceptible change that I was expertly trained to notice. "Alex," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "so glad you could make it. I wasn't sure you would. These big family things can be so overwhelming, can't they?" She was flanked by her husband, my Uncle Mark, a man whose spine had been surgically removed and replaced with a nodding dog spring, and her 2 perfect children, Derek and Tiffany, who smirked at me over their glasses of champagne. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Aunt Carol," I replied, my voice steady. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. In the messenger bag slung over my shoulder, a thick manila envelope felt like it weighed 100 pounds. For weeks it had been my secret, my obsession, my key. Tonight I wasn't sure if it would set me free or simply burn the whole house down. Honestly, I was getting to the point where I didn't care which. The evening wore on, a painful parade of forced smiles and polite inquiries about my little job in archival research. They didn't know the irony. My little job had given me the skills to dig, to follow paper trails, to uncover truths that had been deliberately buried. After dinner, my grandfather, a man weathered by a life of hard work and quiet disappointment, stood up to give a toast. It was short, heartfelt, and full of love for my grandmother. Then, before anyone else could speak, Carol was on her feet, tapping her glass with a fork. She always had to have the last word. "I'd like to say something too," she announced, beaming at her parents. "Mom, Dad, you two are an inspiration. 50 years. Through thick and thin, through triumph and through tragedy." Her eyes swept the room, and as always, they landed on me. The air grew still. I could feel my father tense beside me. He knew what was coming. We all did. "You built something incredible. Carol continued, her voice taking on a quavering, self-pitying tone. A legacy. And even when that legacy was torn away, when things fell apart so suddenly, so inexplicably, you endured. We endured. She took a dramatic pause, letting the weight of her words settle over the silent room. My cousins were looking at me with open hostility now. My grandmother looked uncomfortable. My grandfather just looked tired. Carol raised her glass higher. We endured because we are a strong family. We've had to overcome so much. We've weathered storms and fought back against every curse that has been laid upon us. She said the word curse while staring directly into my soul, a malicious glint in her eyes. It was the most public, most direct she had ever been. It was a declaration of war in front of the entire family. A collective gasp went through the room. My mother reached for my hand under the table, her grip icy. My father started to stand up, his face flushed with anger. "Carol, that's enough," he began. But I gently squeezed my mom's hand and shook my head at my dad. Not this time. I wasn't going to let them fight for me. I wasn't going to sit here and absorb it like I always did. The hammering in my chest stopped. A cold, clear calm washed over me. This was it. This was the moment. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Carol's smug breathing. She thought she had won. She thought she had finally, definitively put me in my place. I slowly, deliberately pushed my chair back. The scrape of its legs on the hardwood floor was deafening. Every head turned towards me. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my bag, my fingers closing around the thick, heavy manila envelope. I pulled it out and placed it on the table with a soft but decisive thud. Aunt Carol's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" she snapped, her voice losing its syrupy sweetness. I stood up, my gaze locking with hers from across the room. I let the silence stretch for another beat, letting every single person in that room feel the shift in the atmosphere. The prey was no longer running. I picked up the microphone from the small podium that had been set up for the toasts. My hand was perfectly steady. "You're right about one thing, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice clear and amplified, cutting through the tension like a knife. The timing of the company's collapse was uncanny. I held up the sealed envelope so everyone could see it. And for my grandparents' 50th anniversary, I thought I'd bring a gift. The gift of truth. Because I have the paperwork from 1998, the year I was born, that proves exactly who brought the curse upon this family. Would you like me to start with the offshore account you opened in the Cayman Islands a week before the bankruptcy filing? The silence that followed my question was a physical thing. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered the cheerful party atmosphere in an instant. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, chaos erupted. Aunt Carol let out a shrill, theatrical laugh that sounded more like a shriek. "Oh, that's Rich," she screeched, pointing a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at me. "That is just perfect. He's finally snapped. All those years of resentment and jealousy have finally made him completely insane." Uncle Mark puffed up his chest, his face turning a blotchy red. "You listen here, you little punk," he bellowed, taking a step forward. "You will not come into this house, my parents' house, and start slinging wild, disgusting accusations. You owe your aunt an apology right now." My father stepped in front of me, a solid wall of paternal fury. "Don't you dare talk to my son that way, Mark. He asked a question. Now let's see the answer." An answer? To what? A madman's ravings? Carol spat, her eyes darting around the room, searching for allies. She found them in her own children, Derek and Tiffany, who were glaring at me with pure hatred. But elsewhere, there was uncertainty. My cousins, my other aunts and uncles, they were looking from me to Carol, their expressions a confused mix of shock and morbid curiosity. The curse had always been a story told in whispers, a piece of family lore. They'd never seen it weaponized so publicly, and they'd certainly never seen anyone fight back. "It's not a raving, Aunt Carol," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the first document. It was a crisp, high-quality scan of a bank statement. I walked towards the center of the room, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor, and placed it on the coffee table for all to see. "This is a wire transfer confirmation from Sterling and Vance Associates, Grand Cayman Branch. The date is October 14th, 1998. The amount is $250,000. The funds were transferred from the primary operating account of Miller & Son Construction." I paused, letting that sink in. The bankruptcy petition for Miller & Son Construction was filed on October 21st, 1998, 1 week later. And the beneficiary of this account? I tapped a highlighted name on the paper. "A C. Miller. That's you, isn't it, Carol?" Aunt Carol stared at the paper, her face draining of all color. "That's a fake," she whispered, her voice suddenly small. "It's a forgery. He made it up on his computer. He works with old documents. He knows how to fake things." My grandfather, who had been standing frozen by his chair, finally spoke. His voice was raspy, heavy with disbelief. "Sterling and Vance. I don't remember any dealings with them." "You wouldn't, Grandpa," I said gently, my heart aching for him, "because they weren't your business partners. They were Carol's. But that was just the seed money." I reached back into the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers, bound with a rubber band. "This is the real masterpiece." I tossed the stack onto the coffee table next to the bank statement. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "These are invoices, 2 years' worth of them, all from a company called Mid-Atlantic Material Suppliers. They supplied Miller & Son with steel rebar, concrete, drywall, millions of dollars worth of materials. Except, there's a problem." I looked over at Uncle Mark, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes wide with panic. "Isn't that right, Uncle Mark? As the company's chief financial officer, you signed off on every single one of these payments. You assured Grandpa that Mid-Atlantic was giving you a deal you couldn't pass up." My grandfather's brow furrowed in concentration. "Mid-Atlantic? Yes, I remember. Mark, you said their prices were 20% below market. You said it was keeping us afloat." "That's what he told you," I confirmed. But my little job in archival research taught me how to dig through public records. It turns out Mid-Atlantic Material Suppliers was a shell corporation, registered in Delaware. It had no warehouse, no trucks, no employees. It was nothing more than a post office box registered to... I pulled out one final sheet of paper, a business registration certificate. Its sole proprietor, Carol Miller. The room erupted. My grandmother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father stared at his sister, his expression one of pure, unadulterated disgust. You robbed your own father," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "No, it's not true," Carol shrieked, finally finding her voice again. "He's lying. Mark, tell them he's lying." But Uncle Mark couldn't speak. He had collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, mumbling, I'm so sorry," over and over again. The confession, weak as it was, hung in the air, an undeniable admission of guilt. It was over. The financial truth was out. But I wasn't finished. The money was one thing. The cruelty was another. That wound was deeper, and I was going to cauterize it with the truth, no matter how much it burned. "For 25 years," I said, my voice growing louder, commanding the attention of every single person in the room. "For my entire life, you let me carry the blame for this. You called me a curse. You poisoned this family against me. You watched me get ostracized, whispered about, and pitied, all while you were living off the money you stole from your own parents." I walked right up to Carol, who flinched back as if I might strike her. "I used to lie awake at night wondering why. Why would you be so cruel? Was it just to cover your tracks? But it was more than that, wasn't it? You enjoyed it. You needed a scapegoat, a villain for the story you told yourselves so you could sleep at night." I reached into the envelope one last time. My hand closed around a single folded yellowed piece of stationery. It wasn't a bank statement or a legal document. It was a letter. I found this tucked away in a box of old company files that was sent to the archives by mistake. It fell out of a 1998 day planner. Your day planner, Uncle Mark. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably Carol's looping, ostentatious script. But the bank statements and the fake invoices aren't the worst part, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing everyone to lean in. The worst part is the why. It's about why you needed a curse so badly. I looked directly into Carol's terrified eyes and read from the paper in my hand. It's a perfect tragedy, Mark. The baby arrives and the fortune vanishes. No one will ever look at the books. They'll be too busy looking at him. The words hung in the air, venomous and indelible. They'll be too busy looking at him. It wasn't just a confession of a crime. It was the christening of a curse, the deliberate, malicious crafting of my life's narrative. The room, which had been buzzing with angry and shocked whispers, fell into a profound, chilling silence. Every eye was on Carol. Her face, which had been a mask of indignant denial, crumpled. The bravado, the arrogance, the sheer force of her personality that had dominated family gatherings for decades simply evaporated. She looked small, cornered, and utterly exposed. My grandfather sank into his armchair as if his legs had given out. He didn't look angry. He looked broken. The vibrant, strong patriarch I remembered from my early childhood was gone, replaced by an old man staring at his own daughter as if she were a stranger. My grandmother was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands. My father took a step towards Carol, his hands clenched into fists, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "You did this," he said, his voice raw with a grief so deep it was terrifying. "You ruined him. You let your own nephew grow up thinking he was poison. For money?" "It wasn't just for money," Carol shrieked, her voice cracking. The dam of her composure had finally burst, and a torrent of long, festering resentment came pouring out. "You don't understand. He got everything. Dad was always going to give him the company." She pointed a shaking finger at my father. "You were the son, the heir apparent. Miller and Son. I was just Carol. I was the one who went to business school, who had the ideas, but I was just the girl who was supposed to marry well. What was I supposed to get? What was my share? He was going to leave it all to you, and I was going to get a pat on the head." My father stared at her, dumbfounded. "Are you insane? Dad was grooming me to take over, yes, but you were always going to be a partner. We talked about it 100 times. Miller and daughter and son, he used to joke. He was so proud of you, of your degree. What are you talking about?" "Jokes, that's all they were," Carol sobbed, fat tears carving tracks through her expensive makeup. "He never took me seriously, not really. And then you had Alex, the first grandson, the next in line. I saw how he looked at him. The legacy was secure, and I was going to be pushed further and further to the side." She turned to my grandfather, her eyes pleading. "You know it's true, Dad. You always favored him." My grandfather looked up, his face a gray mask of sorrow. "Is that what you thought, Carol? That I didn't love you? That I wasn't proud of you?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The money. I could have forgiven the money. People do stupid, greedy things, but to do this to Alex, to your own blood, for a story you made up in your head?" He shook his head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "I don't know you. I don't know the woman standing in my house right now." That was what finally broke her. It wasn't my accusations or my father's rage, but our grandfather's quiet, devastating disappointment. Carol let out a gut-wrenching wail and collapsed onto the floor, a heap of gold lame and shattered lies. Uncle Mark, who had been a whimpering statue this whole time, rushed to her side, trying to gather her up, but she pushed him away. "You were weak," she screamed at him. "You went along with it. It was my plan, but you were the one who signed the papers. Derek and Tiffany, her children, stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. Their entire world, the foundation of their privileged lives and their sense of superiority over me, had just been demolished. Tiffany started crying. Derek just stared at his mother on the floor, his expression unreadable. I watched the scene unfold, this grand implosion I had set in motion. I had expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, but I didn't. I just felt empty. The anger that had fueled me for months had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold ash of exhaustion. This wasn't a victory. It was just a tragedy laid bare. I looked around the room at the faces of my family, the cousins who had tormented me, the aunts who had pitied me, the uncles who had ignored me. They weren't looking at me with contempt anymore. They were looking at me with a dawning horror, the realization of their own complicity slowly sinking in. They had all, in their own ways, bought into Carol's lie. They had perpetuated the narrative. They had helped her place that crown of thorns on my head. My mother came to my side and wrapped her arms around me, holding me tight. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered into my hair. "We should have fought harder. We should have known." "You couldn't have known," I murmured back, leaning into her embrace. She made sure of that. But even as I said it, a new question began to form in the back of my mind. Uncle Mark had been the CFO. He had access, the ability to sign checks and approve invoices. But Carol was in sales. How did she mastermind this? How did she know which accounts to drain? How to create a shell corporation that would pass muster? How to time the collapse so perfectly? She claimed it was her plan, but the mechanics of it, the cold, calculating precision, it felt like something was still missing. My grandfather slowly got to his feet, leaning heavily on the arm of his chair. He ignored the sobbing mess of his daughter on the floor and walked over to the coffee table, picking up the stack of fake invoices. He leafed through them, his hands shaking, his expression growing darker with each page. He stopped at one, his eyes narrowing. He looked up, not at Carol or Mark, but at someone else in the room, someone who had been standing silently in the corner this entire time, watching the drama unfold with a detached, almost clinical interest. "These payment approval codes," my grandfather said, his voice suddenly hard as steel. "They required a secondary sign-off for any amount over $50,000. Mark's signature is here, but the secondary authorization, that's not my signature." He held up the invoice. "This stamp, this signature, I've only seen it on the most sensitive internal audits." His gaze locked onto his brother, my great-uncle Richard, a retired accountant who had always been the quiet, unassuming rock of the family. "This is your signature, Richard. You were my financial consultant for 30 years. You helped me set up the entire system." Richard didn't flinch. He simply pushed his glasses up his nose, his expression unreadable. "It would seem, brother," he said, his voice calm and even, "that Alex didn't find all the documents." The room, already saturated with tension, seemed to lose all its oxygen. My great-uncle Richard's admission, so calm and matter-of-fact, was like a second earthquake hitting the already crumbled foundations of our family. Carol's hysterical sobs hitched in her throat. Uncle Mark's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. All eyes swiveled from my grandfather to his younger brother, the man everyone knew as Steady Richie, the quiet accountant who managed his own small firm, helped everyone with their taxes, and brought the same bland fruitcake to every Christmas party. My grandfather took a faltering step toward him. "Richard? What is he talking about? You helped me build this company from the first brick. You balanced our books for 40 years. You were my right hand." His voice was filled with a bewildered plea, begging his brother to deny it, to provide a logical explanation that would make the world right itself again. Richard, however, offered no such comfort. He straightened his tie, a small, precise movement that was unnervingly calm in the midst of the emotional wreckage. "I did help you build it, Harold," he said, his voice as dry as old parchment. "And I watched you reap all the rewards. I watched you buy the big house, the nice cars, join the country club. I watched you put your children, my niece and nephew, through private schools while my own kids went to public." His gaze flickered to Carol, still a heap on the floor. "I did more than just sign off on the codes. It was my plan." Carol's head shot up, her tear-streaked face a mask of disbelief. "What? No, it was my idea. I came to you for help, for advice on how to get what was mine." "You came to me with a half-baked emotional scheme to skim a little off the top," Richard corrected her coolly, as if he were explaining a simple accounting principle. "You were thinking in terms of thousands. I saw the potential for millions. You wanted revenge. I wanted a retirement plan, a proper one." He gestured dismissively at the chaos. "Your greed and your theatrics made you the perfect instrument, Carol. You were loud. You were obvious. You provided the motive, the drama. All I had to do was guide your hand, create the shell corporation, show Mark which levers to pull, and ensure the paper trail led directly to you and your buffoon of a husband if it ever came out." A collective gasp went through the room. He wasn't just admitting his guilt. He was boasting about his cunning. He had used his own niece as a patsy, a human shield designed to take the fall if his masterpiece of a crime ever unraveled. Uncle Mark scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You son of a bitch! You told me it was foolproof. You said no one would ever know." "And they wouldn't have," Richard replied with a thin, condescending smile. "If your idiot nephew hadn't decided to become a glorified librarian, who could have predicted that?" He looked at me then, for the first time, with a glimmer of what might have been respect, or perhaps just professional curiosity. "How did you find it all, anyway? The offshore accounts, the shell company, those were sealed tight." My blood ran cold. The calm I had felt before was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling chill. This man wasn't like Carol, driven by emotion and perceived slights. He was a predator, cold and calculating. "You made a mistake," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "When you set up Mid-Atlantic, you backdated the initial registration paperwork by 6 months to make it look established. But you used a standardized LLC formation template from a legal software that wasn't released until 3 months after the date you forged. The metadata was still embedded in the digital file you submitted to the state of Delaware." Richard's thin smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Clever," he conceded. "Careless of me." "You used Carol," my father snarled, taking a protective step closer to me. "You set her up to destroy our family, and you were going to let her and my son take the blame for it all." "She was a willing participant," Richard shrugged. "She got what she wanted, a nice nest egg to fund this lavish lifestyle she so desperately craved." He gestured around the room. "And I got mine. The difference is my money is clean, washed through a dozen legitimate businesses over 25 years. It's untouchable." He looked at my grandfather, a flicker of something pity, perhaps, or contempt in his eyes. "You were always the builder, Harold, the one with the grand vision. But you never understood the numbers. You trusted everyone, your son, your daughter, your brother. Trust is a liability in business, a fatal one." My grandfather just stared, speechless, as the betrayal of his own brother washed over him, a final devastating blow. He had lost his company, his daughter's respect, and now the trust he had placed in his own flesh and blood for his entire life. It was a complete and utter ruin. I felt a surge of nausea. This was so much bigger, so much darker than I had ever imagined. My whole life I'd been the family curse. But I wasn't the curse. I was the symptom. The real disease was this rot, this greed and jealousy that had been festering beneath the surface for decades, long before I was even born. Richard was right about one thing. Carol had been the perfect cover. Her loud, dramatic cruelty towards me had been the ultimate misdirection. Everyone was so focused on the ridiculous story of the cursed baby that no one bothered to look at the quiet, unassuming man in the corner, the one who was silently pulling all the strings. Suddenly, a thought struck me, a loose thread from my research that I hadn't been able to place. It was about the bankruptcy itself. The company hadn't just collapsed, it had been liquidated with brutal efficiency. The assets were sold off for pennies on the dollar to a handful of investment groups. It was considered a hostile, predatory liquidation at the time. I remembered tracing the ownership of those investment groups, hitting one dead end after another through layers of shell companies. But there was one name that had appeared on the board of 2 of them, a name I had dismissed as irrelevant. I looked at Richard, at his smug, untouchable face, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "You didn't just help them steal the money, did you?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That wasn't the end game." Richard's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch. "You weren't just taking money out the back door. You were weakening the company from the inside, bleeding it dry so it would be vulnerable. You orchestrated the collapse." I took a step forward, my mind racing as I connected the dots. The liquidation. The investment groups that bought up all of Grandpa's equipment, his land, his contracts, for next to nothing. You didn't want a retirement plan, Uncle Richard. You wanted the whole damn thing. You bought the company. For the first time, Richard's composure cracked. A flash of genuine fury crossed his face. He opened his mouth to deny it, but it was too late. My grandfather had heard me. He turned to his brother, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire I hadn't seen in years. "My company?" he roared, his voice booming through the silent room with all the power of the man he used to be. "You stole my company, Richard?" Richard's face hardened, the mask of civility gone, replaced by the cold face of a shark. "I took what you would never have given me. It's business, Harold, nothing personal." But before my grandfather could respond, another voice cut through the air, small and trembling. It was Tiffany, Carol's daughter, who had been standing silent and shell-shocked this whole time. Her face was ashen, her eyes fixed on her great-uncle. "The trust fund," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The one you set up for me and Derek. For college. The money in it. Where did it come from?" Richard shot her a warning glare, a silent command to be quiet, but it was too late. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. He had made them beneficiaries. He had tied Carol's own children into his web of deceit, and in his arrogance, he'd left one last crucial paper trail. A trail I knew I could find. Tiffany's whispered question acted like a detonator. The implication that her and Derek's entire future was funded by the wreckage of their own grandfather's company was a new personal layer of betrayal that even Carol's histrionics hadn't reached. Derek, who had been standing rigid with a mixture of anger and confusion, finally broke. "What is she talking about?" he demanded, his voice shaking. He rounded on Richard. "Our trust funds? You always told us that was from your own investments, from your firm. Are you saying—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality was too monstrous. Richard's face was a thundercloud. He had been untouchable, insulated by layers of legal entities and the passage of time. But this was different. This was a direct link, a thread that could unravel his meticulously laundered fortune right back to its toxic source. "It's a family matter," he snapped, his voice dangerously low. "It has nothing to do with this." "The hell it doesn't," my father roared, stepping forward until he was almost nose to nose with his uncle. "You used my sister, you destroyed my father, you corrupted your own great-nephew and niece's inheritance with stolen money, and you have the gall to say it's none of our business." "It's my money now," Richard spat back, all pretense of the calm accountant gone. He was a cornered animal. "I made it legitimate. You can't prove a thing. The statutes of limitations ran out a decade ago. There's nothing any of you can do." "Maybe not criminally," I said, and every head turned back to me. The shock in the room had given way to a volatile, superheated anger, and I felt like I was standing in the eye of a hurricane. But Tiffany just gave us the key. Trust funds for minors have to be filed with detailed sourcing of the principal assets to avoid gift taxes. You're a meticulous accountant, Uncle Richard. You wouldn't risk an IRS audit, so you filed the paperwork. And as a beneficiary, Derek, once he turns 25 next month, has the legal right to demand a full, unredacted accounting of that trust's origins from its inception. Derek stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The animosity that had defined our relationship our entire lives was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. We were no longer cousins on opposite sides of a family feud. We were just two young men caught in the blast radius of our elders' greed. I was the scapegoat, and he was the unwitting recipient of the stolen goods. The paper trail will exist, I continued, pressing the advantage, my voice hard and clear. It might be buried under 20 years of legal jargon and shell companies, but it will lead from your clean money right back to the investment groups that liquidated Miller and Son Construction. It won't be a criminal case. It'll be a civil one. And we will sue you for every last penny. We will drain you, Uncle Richard. We'll take the company back, piece by piece, lawsuit by lawsuit. We'll spend the next 20 years making your life a living hell. It was a bluff, partly. I had no idea if it would work, but it was the only weapon I had. The law might not touch him for the old crimes, but the threat of financial ruin in the present? That was a language he understood. Richard's face went pale. He knew I was right. The meticulous nature that had made him such a successful criminal was also his Achilles heel. He would never have left himself exposed to the IRS. The proof would be there. It would be a long, ugly, and incredibly expensive fight, but a fight we could now win. Suddenly, my grandmother, who'd been a silent, weeping figure throughout the whole ordeal, stood up. Her face was pale and tear-stained, but her eyes held a fire I had never seen before. She walked past her sobbing daughter, past her enraged son, and stood directly in front of Richard. "My children's hospital bills," she said, her voice trembling but full of steel. "When Harold had his heart attack after the bankruptcy, we couldn't afford the insurance premiums anymore. We nearly lost this house. You came to us, Richard. You offered us a loan from your personal savings to help us get by." She held up her hand, showing her simple gold wedding band. "You made me use my wedding ring as collateral, my ring, for a loan of our own money." That was it. That single intimate act of cruelty seemed to crystallize all the financial jargon and corporate malfeasance into something everyone could understand. It was pure, distilled evil. My grandfather let out a choked cry and stumbled forward, but my father caught him. Richard actually took a step back from my grandmother, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He could stand up to the rage of men, but the quiet, righteous fury of the woman he had so personally wronged seemed to unnerve him completely. The anniversary party was over. The family was shattered. There was no going back from this. Carol and Mark were huddled together, disgraced and broken. Derek and Tiffany were facing a moral reckoning with the very foundation of their lives. And my grandparents were left to grapple with the fact that their life's work hadn't been lost to a curse or a bad economy, but had been surgically stolen by the two people they should have been able to trust the most. Richard, seeing the tide had turned irrevocably against him, made a move for the door. "I'm leaving," he announced, trying to inject some authority back into his voice. "This is over." "No," my grandfather said, his voice regaining its strength. He straightened up, leaning on my father's arm. "It's not over. Alex, call the police." My hand was already on my phone, but Richard just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't be a fool, Harold. The police, for what? A family squabble over ancient history? There's no proof of anything that isn't protected by a statute of limitations. You have nothing." He was right, and he knew it. A civil suit was one thing, but getting the police involved would be a messy, public battle with no guarantee of victory. He was still untouchable, still arrogant. He reached the front door and put his hand on the knob. "Maybe you're right," I said, and he paused, turning back with a smug look on his face. "Maybe these documents aren't enough for the police." I held up my phone. The screen was lit up, the red recording icon flashing in the top corner. "But the funny thing about a confession, Uncle Richard, is that it creates a whole new timeline." I looked around the room at the stunned faces of my aunts, uncles, and cousins, all witnesses. A full, detailed confession to decades of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering, recorded just 3 minutes ago. I wonder what the statute of limitations is on that. The smug, condescending smirk on Richard's face melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes darted from the glowing red icon on my phone to the faces of the 20 family members arrayed around the room, their expressions ranging from shock to simmering fury. They weren't just relatives anymore, they were a jury, witnesses to his hubris, to the moment his arrogance had finally written a check his meticulously crafted defenses couldn't cash. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of Richard's own ragged breathing. "You're bluffing," he hissed, but there was no conviction in his voice. The bravado was gone, replaced by the desperate scrambling of a man who sees the trapdoor opening beneath his feet. "That's not admissible. You recorded me without my consent." In this state, I only need one-party consent, and as the one holding the phone, "I happily consented," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. I took a slow step forward. "But you're missing the point. This isn't just about a recording, Uncle Richard. It's about your own words, spoken in front of 24 witnesses. You didn't just confess, you boasted. You laid out the entire conspiracy, from motive to execution. You detailed how you manipulated Carol, how you framed Mark, and how you built your fortune on the ruins of this family. You implicated yourself in crimes that have no statute of limitations ongoing conspiracy, money laundering through those trust funds. That's not ancient history. That's happening right now." My grandfather, who had seemed on the verge of collapse moments earlier, now stood tall, a righteous anger burning in his eyes. He pointed a trembling but steady finger at his brother. "Get out of my house!" he commanded, his voice resonating with the authority of a man who had been silenced for too long. "You are no longer welcome here. You are no longer my brother." Richard looked at him, his face a maelstrom of emotions, rage, fear, and a flicker of something that might have been genuine pain. He had won the financial war decades ago, but in that moment he had lost everything else. He was an outcast, excommunicated by the very family he had secretly plundered. Without another word, he turned, wrenched the door open, and disappeared into the night. The moment the door clicked shut, the fragile dam holding the room together broke. My grandmother finally let out a great shuddering sob and collapsed into my grandfather's arms. Carol, who had been watching the exchange with Richard with a kind of horrified fascination, seemed to shrink into herself, the full weight of her role as a pawn in her uncle's game finally crashing down on her. Her own children, Derek and Tiffany, wouldn't even look at her. They slowly made their way to our side of the room, standing awkwardly near my parents, a silent, seismic shift in family allegiances. The war was over, but the casualties were everywhere. The next few hours were a blur of hushed conversations, tears, and logistical decisions. My father, taking charge, made the call. Not to the police, not yet. First, to the family lawyer. The recording and my documents were downloaded, copied, and secured. A strategy began to form a two-pronged attack. A civil suit to freeze Richard's assets and begin the long, arduous process of reclaiming what was stolen. and a carefully presented case to the district attorney's office, leveraging the confession to bypass the statute of limitations on the older crimes. It was going to be a long, brutal fight. As for Carol and Mark, their judgment was swift and delivered not by a court, but by my grandfather. He looked at his daughter, his face etched with a sorrow so deep it was hard to look at. "The money you have," he said, his voice heavy. "The house, the cars, everything. It is blood money. You will liquidate it, all of it, and you will return it. It won't be enough, not even close, but it's a start." He paused. "After that, I don't want to see you. I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Carol, but I know I can't look at you right now." Their exile was as absolute as Richard's. They left without a word, their own children refusing to go with them. In the quiet aftermath, as the last of the family members drifted away with promises of support and tearful apologies to me, it was just the 6 of us left in the wreckage of the living room, my grandparents, my parents, and me. For the first time in my entire life, I felt light. The crushing weight of the curse was gone. The whispers, the stares, the years of self-doubt and loneliness, it had all been a lie, and now everyone knew it. My grandfather walked over to me and put his big calloused hands on my shoulders. He looked me in the eye, and I saw a pride there I had only ever dreamed of seeing. "You saved us, Alex," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent 25 years being a ghost in my own life, ashamed of a failure that wasn't mine. You gave me the truth. You gave me my name back." He pulled me into a fierce hug, and for the first time I felt like a grandson, not a footnote in a family tragedy. Weeks turned into months. The legal battle was everything we expected, a grueling, paper-intensive war of attrition. Richard fought back with a team of high-priced lawyers, claiming the confession was coerced, that I had doctored the recording, that he was an old man being taken advantage of. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents didn't lie, and the combined testimony of the entire family was a dam his lawyers couldn't break. The asset freeze was granted, and the slow process of untangling his financial web began. I became the de facto family historian, working alongside the lawyers, using my archival skills to trace every dollar from its fraudulent origin to its present-day location. Derek, in a surprising turn, threw himself into the fight as well. He was studying finance, and with a convert's zeal, he used his knowledge to help us decipher Richard's complex schemes. We worked side by side, united by a common goal. The animosity of our childhood felt like it had belonged to a different lifetime. One evening, months into the legal fight, I was working late in the lawyer's office, poring over a new trove of documents we had received through discovery from one of Richard's holding companies. It was mostly dense financial records, but tucked inside a folder of old tax returns was a small, leather-bound journal. It was Richard's. Curious, I opened it. It was filled with his neat, precise handwriting, mostly notes on stocks and investments. But one entry, dated a week after the company's collapse in 1998, caught my eye. "The plan was perfect," he wrote. "Harold is broken. Carol is playing her part beautifully. The assets are secured. But there is a loose end, the old server backups. Harold was always paranoid about keeping off-site records. They contain the original, unaltered books from before our adjustments. He thinks they were destroyed in the warehouse fire. He doesn't know I moved them." I sat bolt upright, my heart pounding. A warehouse fire? I remembered hearing about that. It happened right after the bankruptcy. It was ruled an accident, faulty wiring. But Richard's entry made it sound anything but. Then I read the last sentence of the entry, and the blood drained from my face. "They are safe. The only other person who knew where they were is gone, and no one is going to listen to the ravings of a drunk like Frank." Frank Miller, my grandfather's cousin. He had been the company's IT guy. He died in a drunk driving accident 2 days after that warehouse fire. It had been ruled a tragic accident. But now I wasn't so sure. Frank Miller. The name echoed in my memory, a ghost from the family's periphery. I remembered him vaguely from my early childhood, a man with a sad smile and the constant faint scent of whiskey about him. His death had been a footnote in the grand tragedy of the company's collapse, another piece of bad luck in a year full of it. Poor Frank, the family would say. The bankruptcy hit him hard. He just couldn't handle the stress. They'd shake their heads, attributing his demise to a weak character, a tragic flaw. But Richard's journal entry painted a horrifyingly different picture. Frank wasn't a victim of the collapse. He was a casualty of the cover-up. My hands trembled as I read the entry again. The only other person who knew where they were is gone. Gone. Not fired, not paid off. Gone. And Richard's chillingly casual reference to Frank as a drunk suddenly seemed less like a description and more like a strategy. Had Frank's reputation as a drinker been a pre-existing condition, or had it been carefully cultivated, a narrative planted to make his eventual accident seem tragically inevitable? The warehouse fire, the server backups, Frank's death. These weren't separate events. They were a sequence, a cleanup operation. Richard hadn't just committed a white-collar crime. He had graduated to something far, far darker. He hadn't just buried the evidence, he had buried the man who knew where it was. I slammed the journal shut, my mind reeling. The air in the sterile lawyer's office suddenly felt thick and suffocating. This changed everything. We were fighting a civil case for financial restitution, but this journal entry was evidence of potential arson, obstruction of justice, and, most terrifyingly, a motive for wrongful death. The drunk driving accident might not have been an accident at all. My first instinct was to run to my father, to the lawyer, to lay this new horror at their feet. But I stopped myself. Richard's lawyers were sharks. They had already tried to paint me as an unstable, vindictive liar. If I came forward with this journal, they would claim I forged it. They would say I was escalating my family vendetta with wild, unprovable accusations. I had Richard's confession on tape, but this was a whole new level. I needed more than just his words in a diary. I needed the backups. If they still existed, they were the smoking gun, the original, unaltered truth of the company's health before Richard and Carol started bleeding it dry. They were the one thing that could corroborate the journal and turn this case from a financial dispute into a major felony investigation. He doesn't know I moved them. Richard had moved the backups before the fire. But to where? He was arrogant but not stupid. He wouldn't have kept them anywhere obvious. I spent the next 2 days in a feverish haze, cross-referencing everything I could find about Richard's life in the fall of 1998. Property records, credit card statements, phone logs, anything our lawyers had managed to get in discovery. I was looking for an anomaly, a loose thread, something that didn't fit the neat, orderly life of steady Richie. I found it in a property tax record for a storage unit facility on the industrial outskirts of town. The lease was taken out on October 22, 1998, the day after the bankruptcy filing and 5 days before the warehouse fire. It was paid in cash annually for 25 years, never missing a payment. The lease was under a generic business name, RM Archival Solutions, Richard Miller. The name was a private joke, a nod to his own cunning hidden in plain sight. My heart hammered in my chest. This had to be it. I showed my findings to my father and Derek. My dad's face went pale as I explained my theory about Frank Miller. Derek, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical at first, but as I laid out the timeline, his expression hardened. "We need a warrant," he said. "We can't just go breaking into the place." "And say what to a judge?" I countered, the frustration boiling in me. "That I found a secret diary that accuses my great-uncle of a 25-year-old murder, and I have a hunch the evidence is in a storage unit he's been paying for in cash? They'll laugh us out of the building. Richard's lawyers will paint it as a fishing expedition and get it thrown out. We have one shot at this, and it has to be perfect." I knew what I had to do. It was reckless. It was probably illegal, but I also knew it was the only way. That night, armed with a set of bolt cutters and a powerful flashlight, I went to the storage facility. Derek insisted on coming with me. "If you're going to do something this stupid, you're not doing it alone," he'd said, and I was grateful for his reluctant solidarity. The facility was a ghost town, rows of identical metal doors standing silent under the harsh glare of sodium lamps. Unit 237. We found it at the far end of a dimly lit corridor. The lock was old but sturdy. The bolt cutters made a sickening crunch as they bit through the hardened steel. The sound echoed in the silence, and for a terrifying second, I thought we'd set off an alarm. But nothing happened. With a final, heavy snap, the lock fell away. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Derek and I exchanged a look, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He held the flashlight as I grabbed the handle of the roll-up door. It was heavy and stiff from years of disuse. With a loud, groaning shriek of protesting metal, I heaved it open. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a scene frozen in time. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and aging plastic. Stacked against the back wall were a dozen large, heavy-duty computer towers, the kind used for servers in the late 90s. Taped to the side of one was a yellowing label with 2 words written in neat, block letters, M&S Backups. We had found it, the proof, the unaltered truth. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. But as Derek moved the flashlight beam across the rest of the unit, my blood ran cold. The servers weren't the only thing in there. Propped against the wall next to the servers was a rusty, dented 5-gallon gas can. And lying on the floor in front of it, covered in a quarter-century of dust, was a single, mud-caked work boot. But it wasn't the boot that made my stomach clench with dread. It was the dark, reddish-brown stain that soaked the steel toe and spattered up the side of stain that looked terrifyingly like old, dried blood. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the corridor behind us. We froze, our breath catching in our throats. A hulking silhouette appeared in the doorway, blocking our only exit. "I knew you couldn't leave it alone," a voice rasped from the darkness. It wasn't Richard. It was his son. My cousin, David, a man I hadn't seen in 20 years, and in his hand he was holding a gun. The sight of my cousin David, a ghost from a forgotten chapter of my life, standing there with a gun, was so surreal it felt like a hallucination. He was older, heavier, with the same cold, calculating eyes as his father, but they were shadowed by a weariness that spoke of a heavy burden. Derek instinctively moved to stand slightly in front of me, his body tense. The flashlight beam quivered in his hand, catching the glint of the pistol's barrel. "David, what are you doing here?" Derek's voice was strained, a mix of disbelief and fear. "My father called me," David said, his voice a low rumble. "He said you were getting close. He said Alex found his journal. He told me to handle any loose ends." He gestured with the gun towards the servers. "He knew you'd find this place eventually. He's a planner, my old man. Always has a contingency." My mind raced, trying to process the impossible. David had been the family's golden boy before he'd estranged himself years ago, moving across the country after a bitter fight with Richard. We all assumed it was over money or business. We never imagined he was part of this. "You knew?" I breathed, the words catching in my throat. "You knew about all of it?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped David's lips. "I was 17, Alex. I was my father's errand boy. He told me he needed help moving some old office equipment. That's all I thought it was." His eyes drifted to the gas can, and a shadow of deep-seated pain crossed his face. "I was the one who drove the van here. I helped him unload these servers. Later that night, I overheard him on the phone, talking about the warehouse, about making it look like an accident, and about Frank." The pieces clicked into place. Richard hadn't just used his niece. He had used his own son, making him an unwitting accomplice. "And the boot?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David's face contorted in disgust. "I found it in the passenger seat of my father's car the next morning. He was meticulous, but he was in a hurry that night. He must have missed it. He told me Frank got drunk, drove his car off the road. He said the blood was from the accident, but I knew he was lying." He looked at us, his eyes pleading for a strange kind of understanding. I confronted him. I told him I would go to the police. He told me if he went down, I was going with him. My fingerprints were all over the van, all over this unit. I was 17. I was terrified. So I ran. I took the money he offered me for my silence, and I ran as far away as I could. I tried to forget, but you never really forget something like this. "So why are you here now, David?" Derek asked, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at us. "To finish the job? To protect him?" "Protect him?" David spat the words like poison. "He's not a father. He's a monster who ruined my life, who made me a monster too. He called me tonight, not as a son, but as an asset to be deployed. He told me to come here, burn everything, the servers, the boot, everything, and if you two were here, to make sure you were silenced too." He raised the gun, and my heart seized. He promised to wire $1 million to an offshore account the moment I sent him a picture confirming it was done. For a terrifying second, I thought that was it. But then, David's hand lowered slightly. A look of profound conflict warred on his face. "For 25 years I have lived with this," he said, his voice cracking. "With what he did, what he made me do. I've been running, but I've been in a prison of his making this whole time. Tonight, he gave me a choice. Re-up for another life sentence, or finally, tell the truth." Slowly, deliberately, he turned the gun around in his hand and offered it to me, but first, my testimony. The location of the money he offered me. "It's all yours," he said, his voice thick with a quarter-century of anguish and guilt. "I'm done running. Let's burn him to the ground." Though, the resolution, when it came, was swift and absolute. David's testimony, corroborated by Richard's journal, the physical evidence in the storage unit, and the digital evidence on the server backups, was an avalanche that buried Richard completely. The server backups were the key. They showed Miller & Son Construction was profitable and stable right up until the massive fraudulent invoices from Carroll's shell company began. The story of a failing company was a complete fabrication. Faced with irrefutable evidence of arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and decades of financial crimes, Richard's lawyers advised him to take a plea deal. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. He died of a heart attack there 18 months later, a quiet, ignominious end for a man who had orchestrated such loud and lasting destruction. The civil suit was a formality after that. With Richard's empire crumbling, we were able to reclaim a significant portion of the stolen assets. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. My grandfather, with a renewed fire in his belly, didn't retire. He used the settlement to start again on a smaller scale. Miller and Grandson Construction. He put me in charge of the finances. "You have a better eye for a crooked ledger than I ever did," he'd said with a wink. Derek, having finished his finance degree, joined us. The three of us, 3 generations, building something new from the rubble of the old. Carol and Mark divorced. Mark moved away, a broken man. Carol, stripped of her stolen wealth and social status, had to sell her home and take a menial job. She tried to reconcile with her children, but the damage was too deep. Derek and Tiffany kept their distance, forging their own paths free from the poison of their parents' legacy. Carol and I never spoke again. There was nothing left to say. My forgiveness was not hers to have, and her apology, if it ever came, would be meaningless. Her punishment was to live with the truth, stripped of the lie that had defined her for so long. David, for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence for his role in the cover-up. I visited him once before he went away. There was a lightness to him, the look of a man who had finally unshackled himself from a great weight. "Thank you," he said to me through the glass. You freed us all, Alex." In the end, he was right. The truth had been a brutal, painful exorcism, but it had cleansed our family of the rot that had been festering for decades. Last week, we had a family barbecue at my grandparents' house. It wasn't a grand anniversary party, just a simple gathering in the backyard. My cousins, who once treated me like a pariah, now treated me like a hero. We laughed, we shared stories, we healed. As I watched my grandfather at the grill, flipping burgers and laughing with Derek, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The curse was finally broken, not because it had been lifted, but because we had finally learned it was never real. It was just a story, a shadow cast by a terrible crime. And by dragging that crime into the light, I hadn't just found the truth. I had found my family again. I had found my name. And for the first time in my life, I was just Alex, and it was more than enough.